I believe it's time for the law to be enforced. Law enforcement should enforce the law. We have court orders, we have court injunctions, they need to be respected. Okay, these protesters, these activists may have the luxury of spending days at a time on a blockade, but they need to check their privilege.
I think those are not helpful comments in this context. This is a complex situation, and I think that that does not indicate an understanding of the situation.
Hello and welcome to Power and Politics. I'm David Cochran. Vashie is away tonight. Tensions remain high today as a nationwide rail shutdown stretches into its second day. CN Rail's entire Eastern Canada network is still offline, which means Via Rail's passenger trains remain cancelled from coast to coast, with the exception of 2 lines. Some of the protest blockades that caused the stoppage have been dismantled voluntarily, but 3 remain in place. Now, the blockades are a show of support for Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in BC who are fighting the construction of a pipeline on their traditional territory. The largest of those blockades is in Tyendinaga, Ontario, near Belleville. It's been set up for more than a week, and it's where our CBC's Olivia Stefanovich is right now. Olivia, so what's going on where you are?
Well, David, behind me in the community center, the Mohawks of Tyendinaga are meeting with their traditional leadership to discuss tomorrow's high-level meeting with Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller, who's offered to come to the community to discuss the current situation. There aren't many details coming out of this meeting. We've been trying to speak to some people, but they've been reluctant to speak so far. But we do know that they are inviting the minister to come to this community center tomorrow for discussions and to visit the main camp, which has forced down rail service in most parts of this country. Now, the Mohawks say they don't plan to leave anytime soon, but the hope is that the minister will be able to change their minds somehow tomorrow. Also today, David, we heard from the Ontario Superior Court. They granted CN an extended injunction to have police move in to end these demonstrations. But so far, police have decided not to do that, even though they are monitoring the situation. And there's a very good reason for this. They are taking a very careful approach to all of this, trying to de-escalate the situation. And this is also the approach that government has taken so far. They're focusing on dialogue, David, in the hopes that all of this will end peacefully.
Okay, so Olivia, no sign of police action yet. It sounds like this meeting with Mark Miller tomorrow could be key in this. Do we know if the Mohawk are prepared to end the demonstration after their meeting with the minister?
No, they have not given any sign that they are prepared to end their demonstrations. In fact, just over the last 24 hours, there have been more supplies coming into the 2 camps that are set up along the CN tracks here in Tyendinaga. And we heard from the opposition earlier today. They are quite critical of how the federal government is handling this. Conservative Leader Andrew Scheer says he wants the Prime Minister to come back from overseas to address this situation, and he wants the RCMP to intervene. But so far, Trudeau has rejected that. And again, they are taking this careful approach. There is a troubled history in Canada of violence erupting with these protests when police move in. For example, in Ipperwash, Ontario, there was a crisis in 1995 in which an Indigenous protester was shot and killed. So nobody wants a repetition of that. And the hope is that Mark Miller, he has an opportunity tomorrow to sit down with the Mohawks. He has a close relationship with these communities and even speaks Mohawk himself. So the hope is that he can make some progress, but it's unclear what will happen because the Mohawks are so dug into their position, David.
Okay, Olivia, thank you so much. The CBC's Olivia Stefanovich in Tyendinaga, Ontario. So what is the federal government's plan of action over the next few days, and how long could these talks and the rail shutdown drag out? Chris Biddle is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Transportation. He joins me now from St. Catharines. Mr. Biddle, the Prime Minister says that this is a country that recognizes the right to protest, but as a country of the rule of law, and you want to approach this through dialogue and constructive outcomes. How should we interpret all of that in terms of how your government is going to resolve the situation?
Absolutely. We are going to act within our authority. And I know there's some communication from the Leader of the Opposition in terms of suggesting that the Prime Minister can pick up the phone and order the RCMP, or the Premier of Ontario could order the OPP to break down the barricades. But that's not something that we can do. We're a country that abides by the rule of law. And in terms of, we will do what we can in the meantime, and that's keeping the lines of dialogue open, communicating with the protesters that are engaged in protest, calling upon them to abide by the law of the land. But in the meantime, we're going to do what we can. And I know Ministers Miller, Bennett, are working very hard, and Minister Garneau working very hard to ensure a peaceful resolution to this crisis.
Right, but here we are. The trains are still shut down. You know, hundreds of trains canceled, thousands of people inconvenienced. It's only been in the last little while that Ministers Miller and Bennett got directly involved, at least in offering to meet with people to hopefully resolve the standoff. So why did it take so long for the federal government to take direct action in dealing with the protesters?
Well, my understanding is that the ministers have been involved all week long, that lines of communication have remained open, that it's now the right time for them to step in and engage in negotiation. They've been open with their provincial counterparts in BC and Ontario, and the dialogue continues and has continued since this started.
But dealing with your provincial counterparts and local authorities is not necessarily dealing with the Wet'suwet'en or their supporters in this. The government seemed to take the approach of allowing provincial and local authorities to deal with this first before coming into it late. I mean, did you make a mistake by waiting this long to get directly involved, at least in that way?
I don't know that it's a mistake, and we want to work with the provinces and don't want to overstep our authority. The federal government stepping in too early can be a concern as well, and so we were in constant communication when it required the federal government to step in. I know the ministers were there and ready to move forward and assist wherever possible. And that's what we're standing ready to do, and we'll keep doing.
I want to circle back to what you referenced off the top, and those would be the comments by Conservative Leader Andrew Scheer, where he called some of these protesters radical activists, called for the non-Indigenous ones to check their privilege, and asked for the Prime Minister to direct Bill Blair to direct the RCMP to go in and settle this. Are comments like that helpful in this situation?
Absolutely not. And I know, looking at my local mayor, I don't look at him as the chief of police for my municipality. And it's the same with the Premier of Ontario and the Prime Minister of Canada. We're blessed to live in a country where we have the rule of law and where elected officials don't direct the police. And these types of comments only lead to that are inflammatory. They don't help the situation. And I know I've heard from constituents that want to see a resolution to this. But if we look back in recent history to Ipperwash and Oka, we can see that an action in that regard may have unintended consequences to exacerbate the protests and lengthen what could be resolved peacefully.
Do you think that could happen in this situation? Are there any signs that it could escalate to that point if the police do feel they have to move in?
I can't comment on that, and it's the police on the ground who have the best view of things, and that's why they're the ones responsible for enforcing court orders, enforcing the law of the land, and they have the best interests of Canadians. They will ensure that the safety of Canadians is that's their top priority, and they will take action as required.
Andrew Scheer, though, isn't the only one calling for the police to go in and do this. We've heard this from a lot of ordinary Canadians who've grown frustrated with the impact this has had on their daily lives, on the economy. I mean, what do you say to people who want to see police action or some sort of more aggressive action to end this and get the trains moving again?
I hear this because I know some people are saying that this is about big business and getting trains moving, but we're starting to hear about layoffs. We're starting to hear about food not being delivered and farmers being inconvenienced. And I know people want to see a speedy resolution to this, but again, if we look at past actions by police in Oka and in Ipperwash, it only made the situation worse. And so I trust the RCMP, I trust the OPP to do the right thing, to act on the ground, but it's up to the federal government to work with the protesters and ensure and do our best while the police aren't intervening to see if we can have a peaceful resolution, because ultimately that will be the best, quickest way to resolve this crisis.
Are you worried about the precedent all of this sets? I mean, this is about a standoff in Wet'suwet'en territory, but you guys bought a pipeline with Trans Mountain and you're building it and you're going to push it through some borders, and I suspect we can expect a level of resistance to that as well.
Well, I can only speak to this, and this isn't the first protest on the rail line in Ontario. But that being said, we're focused on this crisis. We're focused on trying to find a resolution to these issues and addressing and meeting with the protesters as soon as possible and trying to resolve it as best we can.
Are the police holding off until Minister Miller and Minister Bennett meet with the various groups involved in this?
It goes both ways. The police aren't informing me of their decisions, and that's not something that they should do. But again, I'm hopeful that Minister Miller and Minister Bennett will have success in resolving these standoffs.
And what if they don't? I mean, how long is the federal government prepared to let this go on? I mean, the offer of the meeting in British Columbia has taken down the barricade near North Hazelton, but we still have the standoff in Ontario. I mean, this has gone on for over a week. How much longer are you prepared to let this go on?
Well, again, it's not the federal government that's deciding in terms of the enforcement of the law. If an action is illegal, we cannot legislate it to make it more illegal. It was up to the police to enforce the law, and we leave it in their capable hands, and it will be up to the RCMP and the Ontario Provincial Police to make those determinations. It is not up to elected officials. And comments like Andrew Scheer's are purely inflammatory, do not help the situation, and mislead Canadians to think that the federal government or Parliament can resolve this situation when laws have already been passed on the subject.
Just one quick final point before I let you go. This has obviously had an impact on the domestic economy, but CN has said that it's having an impact beyond Canada's borders, with trading partners saying we're now no longer a reliable part of supply chains. Do you share those concerns on the international ripple effects of these disruptions?
Well, I can't speak to that. I can speak to the frustrations of my constituents who are worried about the flow of goods, they're worried about jobs and potential layoffs. There is a GM factory in my riding, and I know we have concerns about that across Ontario and across Canada. And that's why we're going to work as hard as we can within the bounds of the law to ensure that there's a speedy resolution to this crisis.
Okay. Chris Biddle, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Well, the trains aren't moving, but protests across the country have not lost steam as we enter day 2 of a nationwide rail shutdown.
What do we do when Indigenous matriarchs are being ripped from their land at gunpoint? Stand up, fight back!
From Victoria to Fredericton to Corner Brook, Newfoundland, groups organized demonstrations in support of Indigenous land rights. The cross-country movement began last week when the RCMP enforced a court injunction on BC's Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. They're fighting the construction of a pipeline on their traditional territory. Now, the federal government has said no relationship is more important than the relationship with Indigenous peoples, but do recent events suggest that relationship is broken? Ry Moran is the director of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. He joins us from Winnipeg. Ry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
We've seen the signs at the protests in Victoria saying reconciliation is dead. What does this week say to you about the state of reconciliation in this country?
Well, look, we have to recognize that we are attempting to reconcile an extraordinarily difficult history in this country. Canada recently celebrated its 150th birthday, but in that is the creation of a singular nation state on top of long-standing Indigenous nations from coast to coast to coast. This has been a substantive challenge for Indigenous peoples. It has resulted in Canada both affecting things like the residential schools and other efforts of cultural genocide. And the reconciliation that's actually occurring is trying to reconcile this imposed state on top of long-standing centuries, millennial-old nations.
What do you think of how the federal and provincial governments have handled this so far? It's been more of a soft approach, reaching out diplomatic means. Has this been the right approach?
Look, when we look at what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called for, is it says we have to establish and maintain mutually respectful relationships. And I think that's really, really important for us to pause on that language. One, it says we have to establish, okay? That says that up to this point, Canada has not enjoyed respectful relationships with Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples, Indigenous histories, and cultures, and identities, and lands, okay? So we're in that process right now. Then we have to maintain those. The fact that provincial, federal governments are reaching out, trying to build those bridges, trying to create that respectful dialogue, and one that is based on fundamental human rights and Indigenous rights principles is positive, but we've still got a long ways to go before we're fully into that type of relationship that we need to succeed as a country.
So the federal government seems to be preaching patience here. It's not taking any action to try to accelerate any sort of police intervention here. But Conservative Leader Andrew Scheer said today that if he was Prime Minister, he would direct his Public Safety Minister to direct the RCMP to get in there and end this, and said that protesters need to, in his words, check their privilege. What does that do in a situation like this?
You know, we have multiple examples that have already been referenced by previous speakers on your program here today of police actions going terribly wrong and people losing their lives as a result of those actions. I do not want to see that. I don't think our country wants to see that. I don't think anybody should be rushing into increasing the conflict here or further weaponizing this conflict. This is very, very sensitive an issue. People feel very passionate about it, and rightly so, because we have to take a step back. We have to take a big step back here and recognize that there's two fundamental questions that are posing, that are being posed to this country and really to us as humankind. A, how are we going to live together, peacefully in a way where everybody wins? That's what reconciliation is about. And then how are we going to live together with the land? And in a time of serious crisis, where we know that the climate is profoundly at risk, and people are taking this very, very seriously. So everything's already amplified. We've got some very difficult issues in the present and in the future, and we should not be trying to rush into, armed conflict of any sort.
But, as you say, take a step back. The trains can't move forward at all because of this standoff. People are growing frustrated. On one side, there's the economic impact, and then you also have protesters saying things like reconciliation is dead. So how critical is this week in this path to reconciliation that the federal government is trying to walk?
This week, in my opinion, is yet further reminder that we cannot, effectuate reconciliation fast enough in this country. We've had 94 calls to action that were issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 5 years ago already. And we really have to ask ourselves, how many of those have been implemented? And what are the barriers? What are the delays? The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, has been around for a long time, yet Canada only adopted it fully a few short years ago. We've missed so many opportunities to have prevented this current day crisis. And I think this week, if nothing else, should be a very powerful reminder to everybody to take the long-standing calls for the establishment of these respectful relationships to be brought fully into all aspects of society. And that applies to businesses, that applies to public officials, that applies to rebuilding governance structures. We have to do the hard work now, because otherwise these types of conflicts are going to continue, and it's going to continue to impair Canada reaching its full potential.
But, this particular conflict and the rail shutdown, it stems from the issue with the Wet'suwet'en and Coastal GasLink. Mm-hmm. And you have division there, right? I mean, you have the 13 hereditary chiefs who oppose this pipeline, the 5 elected band councils who support it, and 15 other elected band councils from other First Nations who support it. How do you have a nation-to-nation relationship as a federal government when the Indigenous nation is divided?
Yeah, well, first of all, we have to recognize what that source of division is and how that division materialized. Okay, so just like Indigenous health, Indigenous economy, a whole bunch of things, this crisis has been manufactured by intentional, long-standing government policies that sought intentionally to deconstruct and eliminate traditional Indigenous governance systems from this land. Now what we're confronted with is a process of internal reconciliation within the community where it itself has to figure out how it is going to rebuild and heal from what has been defined as, long-standing cultural genocide. In this regard, the government has a proactive responsibility to support the healing of this community. And the problem is that we've got this terrible crisis where a lot of this reconciliation that needs to happen inside of the community is being done under duress with a big national push to try to get things done. We've got to make sure that communities are fully supported in healing and recovering from this onslaught of destruction that has been present in Canadian society since the beginning of time.
Okay, Ryan Moran, thank you so much for your insight and your time. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
That's Ryan Moran of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation.
We are a country that recognizes the right to protest, but we are a country of the rule of law, and we will ensure that everything is done to resolve this through dialogue and constructive outcomes.
I believe it's time for the law to be enforced. Law enforcement should enforce the law. We have court orders, we have court injunctions, they need to be respected. These protesters, these activists, may have the luxury of spending days at a time on a blockade, but they need to check their privilege.
Okay, so tensions remain high today as a nationwide rail shutdown stretches into its second day. CN Rail's Eastern Canada network is still offline, which also means that Via Rail's passenger trains remain cancelled largely from coast to coast with the exception of just 2 lines. Now, the rail blockades that force the stoppage are a show of support for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs in British Columbia who are fighting the construction of a pipeline on their traditional territory. Provincial and federal meetings with Indigenous groups are underway or in planning stages to try to resolve that situation. In fact, we've just learned that Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller will meet with Mohawk representatives in Tyendinaga tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. But some politicians say enforcing the law is an immediate step that could be taken. Earlier this afternoon, I spoke with the Premier of Saskatchewan, Scott Moe. He was in Regina. Premier Scott Moe, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dave.
I want to start with the economy, and I will get a sense of how these blockades are affecting Saskatchewan industries that rely on rail to ship goods. So what's the status in your province right now?
Well, in Saskatchewan, we're very reliant on a number of different transportation mechanisms to get our products out. Road, of course, pipeline is very important to our province, but also rail. We ship out 10% of our energy products are shipped on rail, all of our potash products, our agri-food products, as well as some timber products and a number of other smaller items as well. So this is very problematic when we have these slowdowns and shutdowns in some areas of the nation. We have agri-food trains that are stopped with Saskatchewan grain on them, Saskatchewan energy on them, and this already has an impact on our economy in Saskatchewan, and will continue to have, even if they start running shortly, will continue to have a negative impact on our economy for days and likely weeks to come.
How much of a negative impact? Can you quantify it? Do you have a sense of what the dollar hit might be on a daily basis?
It'll be in the tens of millions, likely the hundreds of millions of dollars at the very least, maybe even larger than that. From what I understand, we are getting very, very tight with respect to our capacity to continue to produce potash, for instance, as our storage areas are full here in the province and there's no trains coming to move that product out. Our bins are full, our elevators, our terminals across the province are full with no trains moving that product out, and we will in very short order have boats waiting in harbors from coast to coast in this nation. So the impact is going to be quite severe as we go through this process, and it's going to build and compile on impact that we've already had in some challenges in getting our rail capacity up earlier this year with the potential of a CN rail strike, as well as pile on, if you will, to some of the costs that we had just in this harvest, drying all of our crop and paying such unnecessary taxes on the gas that we were using, such as a federal carbon tax.
On this issue of resolving the standoffs at the blockades, the Prime Minister said this afternoon that his government's taking a whole-of-government approach to this. They've been in touch with provincial and territorial counterparts. Have you or your government had any conversations with the federal government about how to resolve this blockade situation?
Our Minister of Highways and Infrastructure has written to the Minister of Transportation. I'm not aware of any direct return or reply or phone calls that have occurred, although I've had a short conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister on this and what the potential impacts could be. And we agree that this does need to be a whole of approach. There does need to be reaching out to these Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders to have a discussion with them. But the whole of the approach also involves the enforcement of the law. This is hamstringing our Saskatchewan and Canadian economy and has the potential to put us into what would be a crisis as far as receiving goods into our communities and continuing to export goods to our markets around the world.
I wonder then, how do you assess how the federal government has handled this? It seems in the early stages they would defer to local authorities and provincial authorities to resolve this, and then getting into it midweek with the offer of meetings with Carolyn Bennett and with Mark Miller to try to resolve it almost through a diplomatic or political solutions. How do you think the federal government has handled this so far?
They need to be very, very urgent from this point on, not only with their meetings, but with ensuring and directing the law to be enforced. As I always say, the enforcement of the law is not a choice. How that law is enforced is up to the the law enforcement agencies in that respective jurisdiction. But this is the federal jurisdiction. Pipelines and rail lines are within the federal jurisdiction, and for example, Saskatchewan is having a great negative impact with respect to these blockades, but we do not have a blockade in the province of Saskatchewan. So this lies squarely in the federal jurisdiction. They need to direct the enforcement of the law, and they need to reach out, as you said, with a whole of an approach and meet with these hereditary leaders and try to get to a better place with respect to them. But the illegal blockades, and they are illegal, cannot continue, and the law needs to be enforced with respect to those.
Just one more on that point. You say urgent from this point on. Do you think they've handled it okay up to this point, and it's time to change their tack, or have they been too slow getting to this level of involvement?
I would indicate that the comments around this being in the provincial jurisdiction or the local jurisdiction were not helpful, and it would have been wise to bypass those comments and take the responsibility as it rightfully lies within the federal government. And I use the example again of Saskatchewan is impacted negatively by these blockades, yet we have no blockade in our province. This is why railways, pipelines, major transportation infrastructure is in the jurisdiction of the federal government, and the enforcement of ensuring that infrastructure is in place and operable so that we can continue to create wealth and access supplies for our communities lies squarely within the federal jurisdiction. They need to engage, yes. They also need to ensure that infrastructure is operable, and if that entails enforcing the law, enforcing the injunctions that have been put out by the courts, then that's what needs to happen.
Okay, so on that point, Andrew Scheer came out today and said the Prime Minister should return to Canada from his trip. He should direct Public Safety Minister Bill Blair to direct the RCMP to resolve this situation. Do you think that is the right approach, what Andrew Scheer is suggesting?
Yes, the Prime Minister should return. He should direct his Public Safety Minister to direct the law enforcement agencies to enforce the law. Listen, in this democracy, as I always say, it's legislators or parliamentarians that make the laws. It's the courts that interpret those laws. Both of those have happened in this case. The law is there. The courts have deemed an injunction and deemed that these blockades are illegal. And there's only one step left, and that is for the law enforcement agencies to enforce the law. Now, how they enforce that law as far as their initiatives is at the discretion of the RCMP or the law enforcement agency responsible. But the fact of whether or not they enforce the law, that is not at their discretion. That is a function of a functioning democracy and a function of being able to govern our nation.
Right, but Marc Garneau was asked about this today, the Transportation Minister. He referenced Ipperwash, he referenced Caledonia, how things have escalated in these situations when police have gone in perhaps too early and escalated the situation, and the Prime Minister has pushed back on the idea of a politician directing the police force on how to act. I mean, how do you respond to those concerns raised by federal ministers and the Prime Minister?
Well, the politician should not direct the police force on how to act. A politician should direct the police force to enforce the law. That is why we have police forces of all different kinds, whether they be municipal or the RCMP, is to do just that. A democracy, as I say, is founded on the fact that the laws are made by parliamentarians, they're interpreted by the courts, they're enforced by our law enforcement officials. That needs to happen.
Andrew Scheer also said today that some of the protesters who are at the rail lines should check their privilege and let the trains come through. What do you make of that kind of a statement? Is that helpful in this situation?
Well, on many of those trains is, let's use the example of Saskatchewan agri-food product, the most sustainable food product that the world can access, grown right here in the province of Saskatchewan. That product should go through, as I'm sure it's important to many of these individuals that are attempting and successfully blockading illegally our trains, that we are able to deliver some of the most sustainable agri-food product to the world.
Right, but the comments, not the cargo. I mean, the cargo, obviously, I understand why you wanted to get through, but comments like that by the National Conservative Leader, are those helpful in this situation?
Well, I think that's where part of this goes with respect to check your privilege. We're exporting some of the most sustainable products in the world, displacing much dirtier products. We should allow those products to go through. This is why we advocate for pipelines, so that we can put some of the most sustainable Canadian energy in those pipelines and send it to other people in North America and people around the world. We have now 10% of our energy is on the rails. We have some of that energy that has been derailed just east of our city of Saskatoon here for the second time now in 2 months, and that's product that shouldn't be in those rail cars. It should be in a pipeline. So with respect to how we are moving our products across this nation and to our export markets, some of the most sustainable products in the world, there should be some research done with respect by these individuals with respect to the sustainable products that we provide to the world and how that is actually improving on our environmental footprint as global citizens. We shouldn't be stopping some of these products from getting to their markets around the world. And that's precisely what we're doing in this nation. It's hurting us economically, it's hurting us globally from an environmental perspective, and it shouldn't be happening.
Okay, Premier Scott Moe, thank you so much for your time.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.